Hi, everyone. I wanted to give a mini lecture for um, for women's studies, and the reading here, well, the title of this module is The Next Frontier: Control of Your Body, and the readings are Women After Gaining Suffrage, and then there's additional links. You do not have to read those, but it's just, kind of helpful additional information. One of them being the history of women's reproductive rights, Margaret Sanger's writings, and then, of course, the Griswald versus Connecticut 1965 Supreme Court case. There are a number of documentaries that touches upon that particular case. If you want to look at the 14th Amendment, it's called Amend on Netflix. It's also free on YouTube that touches upon that. You could also find a couple of other documentaries on Frontline PBS YouTube channel that is free. And then you can kind of look up in the search engine on YouTube for PBS Frontline documentaries, Griswold versus Connecticut, and I'm sure you'll find a few things. I'm sorry, I have a cough. I think I'm finishing up with bronchitis, the way that things are looking with my cold. I wanted to jump in and give a little bit of context since I don't have any slides for this module. And to kind of have this conversation. So, about last few weeks, we dealt with Republican motherhood, which was the limitation of what women's rights would be, is to raise your son to be a good man. And then maybe he'll make good decisions that will consider women. And then you you're finally pushing towards suffrage. And one of the reasons why suffrage becomes such a big deal is because women did not have rights when it comes to working, when it comes to certain employment, because and also when it deals with what, which we'll read about in the next module, about the most oppressive situation, which they considered was marriage. And the argument about how marriage, because it's like this contingent concept. It's religion and marriage, and how religion, and it's synonymous, is demonstrated as the foundation of what home relationships should be like, which the father, the husband at the head, the wife is beneath, the children are the lowest. And when you have a father at top, wife secondary, you're dealing with this larger issue of that begins to take place, where what happens if one, the husband doesn't want to be with you anymore, two, your husband dies, three, you never get married. And these three things leave women extremely vulnerable to men. And so we are now left with these larger problems of what happens to women. So they either become, there's a really interesting book called Maud Flanders, um, that kind of deals with this issue of the plight of what a woman has to deal with when it comes to, you married a man who is not honest, what happens with the issue of when you're left alone, what happens when you also are end up unmarried, what happens when you're widowed. And Moll Flanders had to deal with all of those encounters. You end up working in places, and then there comes a point where you cannot be a prostitute because you're just too old. So you're working in these really tough jobs, which tends to be like sewing and all of those, that kind of manual labor. But that leads to workers' rights. Hey, do I not have rights as a worker? Do I not have rights to get paid? And then do I have rights to have ownership of my body? So part of suffrage was an argument of first workers' rights, and then second, it became there is no greater issue that a woman deals with but control of her body. Um, being pregnant, having children is a oppressive act. We can talk about all the positivities, but the argument that they're writing about is this level of oppression. So I should have the right to choose if and when and how I would like to have a child. It could be that I don't want to have a child. It could be that if I decide to have a child, I should determine when this actually takes place, and it shouldn't be staggered upon each other. And that is the framework of this. However, I'd be remiss to say that some of this writing and some of this work was not also built on eugenics, on not just if you should have a child, determining when you should have a child, if you should have a child, but it's also determined who should have a child. So it's not just based, of course, it's easier to focus on the racial component, but it's actually a little bit more interesting to focus more on other components such as um, class, because those conversations were happening. Also, disabilities, because those conversations were happening, and and the courts were actually okay with preventing certain people with certain disabilities from having children. It's a terrible concept. And the language is absolutely very harsh. If you go back and look at what some of the courts have ruled in regards to how sterilization became, and is in some respects still kind of legal, without the permission of the woman being able to determine if and when sterilization can take place. But I do think it's important. I do think it's important to realize, to have that conversation, especially when we're thinking about Margaret, because Margaret absolutely ascribed to eugenics, and that was rooted in whiteness. It was also rooted in ableist concepts. So I don't think that you should, it's important. I don't think that you should negate everything that she was pushing for, which was the opportunity for women to take control of their bodies in this way, and the need to be able to vote to pass policies that would consider the uniqueness of women, which is the ability to have, or if they would like to have a child. And we're still kind of arguing in this, having women who who will, and men who will consider the uniqueness of women when it comes to having a family, but also want to have a career. And what does that look like? We're at a point in society currently where where our society cannot live without women working. And we saw this during COVID. When the society was opening back up, but they didn't really want to, and we're debating like, oh, you need to get people back to work, but you weren't considering childcare issues, school issues, and then realizing how detrimental it was to have women not in the workforce efficiently because of their home life. Because even when there are women, married women, we could talk about single women for sure. They have a different unique plight, but when you're talking about married women, we see that even when husband and wife are sitting at the house together, the wife is still more involved and responsible, not all, but the vast majority, more responsible for the children than said husband. And so when you had this issue when it came to COVID-19, that's when companies began to really take a very interesting look that there are not enough men in society, in our American society, United States of America society, who are able to fill all the jobs and women to no longer be in the workforce. You need women in the workforce. And that's just is a fact. And so now what do women need to have in order to be effective in the workforce? And finally, we're beginning to have a more significant conversation than what we had in the past. And so I think that that's an awesome attribute that has completely taken place. But this conversation is over 100 years old in the United States, and it starts here. And so as you're doing these readings, looking through some of these links, consider the extreme fight and the convincing that these women were having to explain that they would like a choice about controlling their reproductive life. Also consider the amount of pushback that people have against women making a very basic statement. I want to make decisions about my reproductive system. And that's where these, kind of readings take place. It's, the conversation of who owns women's reproductive systems. Is reproduction the ability to reproduce, and thus women's uniqueness and ability to carry a child full term to or short term and to reproduce in that way, does it then make their womb a societal consideration? Is it possible that women may never fully have, because of their societal implications of them making choices for their own individual reproductive life? Is it a possibility that they should not have complete ownership because of societal implications? I mean, that's conversation that's happening. That's happening currently, 100 years later. I hope you enjoy this chapter, and I look forward to seeing and reading your thoughts throughout this module.